everyone. Welcome to lunch with Linda and Jerry. And I would like you to type in the Q&A box if you can hear me. I'm just double checking that sound one more time. The Q&A box, while we're on the topic, is also going to be a place where you can pose questions to Jerry and Linda, although there is a 15-minute presentation first, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. And we have a lot of resources at the end of the presentation as well. We have, thanks Erin for saying you can hear me. Thank you, Matt. We have two polls, one at the beginning to kind of gauge who we're talking to, and we have one at the end to kind of gauge what you learned. This is our first webinar of this topic area, and we're kind of fielding the structure of it, so any kind of feedback that you can send me after the fact would be great as well. So without further ado, with me today I have Linda Drake, State Board of Education Director of Career and College Readiness, and Jerry Price, OSPI Social Studies Program Supervisor. Say hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Anything you want to say before we kick off the PowerPoint?
No, just pleased as punch that everybody was able to join us today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Hope everybody has their bagged lunches.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Oop. Still with me, everyone? All right.
All right. So for the conversation today, you've got a schedule here. We're going to talk about the current social studies requirements, that is for students who are currently in class. We're going to look at what are the changes that have happened and why to the WACs, and how it's going to affect you in the districts, your teachers and your students. And then I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about some resources that are available to you and information that may be helpful, and then we'll provide you with our contact information.
So we put the poll up, and it looks like quite a few people have taken it. We have a few administrator and principals, some school district employees, school counselors, mostly administrator, principal roles, and teachers. We're going to close the poll. That gives you a little bit of a sense, and we'll open again at the end. Administrator principal is our biggest audience this time.
Not surprised.
All right.
Ooh, wow.
Okay, so this is Linda, and I'm just going to go over what the current social studies graduation requirements are. There was a bit of a change in the social studies requirements as a result of new rules that the State Board of Education just approved in November. The board had to update the rules to address House Bill 1599, and while we were changing it, we did some updating of other things as well. While we were under the hood, we addressed some things. So for social studies, there is 3 credits of social studies that are required. That hasn't changed. But those 3 social studies credits includes 2 credits of prescribed courses plus 1 credit of social studies electives. The prescribed courses include 1 credit of US history, half a credit of contemporary world history, geography, and problems, and half a credit of civics. Now, there was a change in the civics law so that as of 2021, districts must offer civics as a standalone course. And that means for the class of 2024, that it becomes a graduation requirement. That is, that districts must offer the course by 2021, and that students in the class of 2024 must meet that requirement through a standalone course. And then Washington State history, of course, is required, but not for credit. Okay, and move forward 1 slide.
Fast as lightning.
So why the change to CWP? This was to provide more flexibility to districts as they implement the standalone civics requirement. Districts are not required to make any change to CWP if they don't want to, but they may if they want to have more room in the schedule for a standalone civics. And of course, the changes in these rules coincides with the changes due to House Bill 1599. Now I think that, I'll ask Jerry for this, but that it probably would be a good idea for the for half a credit of the electives to address world history.
Right. So there's technically no world history credit requirement, which makes me sad. We've had the full year of CWP that I fully support, but it was creating some issues with districts who are trying to basically shoehorn their civics requirement in with CWP at the senior level. That's where a lot of people want to put both of those courses. And so a lot of districts were kind of fudging on the CWP by doing a semester of CWP, a semester of civics, and then trying to turn their world history, ancient civ, etc., at the lower grade levels into a CWP course as far as the credit requirement goes, without actually teaching contemporary world problems within that context. So what we've tried to do is to alleviate that stress with districts. We still encourage you to do it an additional half of or a semester of or half credit of CWP or world history but we wanted to provide you some more flexibility to do that within your schedules.
Right, and just to reiterate, if you like your current CWP course, you don't need to change it. It just is a change in the rules to try and provide more flexibility. So this is just a slide to fill you in on the background, to step back and say, why did these changes happen? So you probably recall over the last few years that social studies requirements have changed. For the class of 2016, there was an increase from 2.5 credits to 3 total credits for civics. Half a credit of civics was added at that time, although at that time also civics could be embedded in another course. That change was part of the phase-in of the 24 credit graduation requirements. Back in 2013, there was an increase in math. For the class of 2016, there was an increase in social studies and English. And then for the class of 2019, for those districts that didn't have a waiver to delay the implementation of the 24 credits, there was an increase in the science requirements. So as you're all aware, House Bill 1896 created that requirement that civics be a standalone class. And but there was an exception in the law for courses through which students can earn both high school and post-secondary credit. So for dual credit courses, civics may be embedded, but it must address the civics content. Right.
So we don't want you to pull a student out of AP US History to put them in a standalone civics if civics is being embedded already in the APUSH class. So we want to make sure that those students who are taking those higher level courses that are college credit embedded, that they have that opportunity to do so without a crunch in their schedule that makes it really difficult for them to get the credits that they need to graduate. So dual credit, any of those classes. Just make sure that you are familiar with the civics legislation, and it's on the Social Studies website, of what the 6 elements of civic education are that are required by the legislation, so that you make sure that any classes that you are embedding that dual credit in, where you're going to be giving that civics credit, that they are actually addressing the legislative requirements for civic ed. All right, so I'm going to give you some resources and some information. And so this has some hyperlinks, and I don't know if we'll be able to activate those, but just so that you know, all of this information is on the Social Studies website on the OSPI. So if you go to OSPI and then you click on the different content areas and slide down to Social Studies, you're going to see access points for all of this information. So we do have the new Social Studies standards. We have them presented to you in 2 ways. So we have a green box at the top of the standards page, which gives you the comprehensive standards, that is K-12, so you can see how we've done vertical alignment and how we build in rigor from kindergarten through senior year. And then we have them stranded out so that you can just provide your teachers, if you would like, with the 9-12 standards. You'll notice that the high school standards haven't changed appreciably. as far as the content, because our content hasn't shifted appreciably at the high school level, but what we have done is to try to make it more inquiry based, and to also get people to focus instead of the minutia of names, dates, etc. We've got enduring understandings, which are similar to a compelling question at the top, so that there's a more holistic idea of you're really looking for what are students going to leave your classroom knowing for each of those standards. And we've also brought skills to the top instead of as the sort of hanging chad, for those of you who need a late 80s, early 90s reference. So the skills are at the top as the umbrella. So we want students to have those critical thinking skills, and we want those to be really called out, especially with the increased rigor of high school courses. We also have the open educational resources, which are free. Open education resources means that you have the ability to use those in the classroom without worries about copyright violations. You can alter them in most cases, etc. And those are on the Washington OER site, which is also linked through our social studies page. And you can just type in WA OER on your Google search or your browser search, right? Yeah. Bing, whatever it is that you choose to use, and pull those up. And those are educational resources that are available. And the thing I really want to call out to you is that we've created a civics folder in the 9 through 12 open educational resources under social studies, which builds, it has basically a graphic organizer that contains a multitude of civic education materials. And then it also tells you which of the 6 civic requirements in the legislation it meets. It includes some inquiry design model lessons. It includes a bunch of things from the League of Women Voters, Secretary of State's office, Project Citizen. I mean, anything that's civic education related, we've tried to put the ones that we are allowed to put in there. We've also put in Puyallup's civic education course, because they designed an open education resource civics course quite a while ago and have been building on it since then. And so if you're right now taking time to try to figure out what your civics course is going to look like, or you're having some issues with being able to adopt curriculum when you need to next year, there are open educational resources that you can build a civics course without having to buy textbooks right now, right? So those are available to you. And then the last thing I wanted to just put in a plug for, it's not necessarily about the graduation requirements, but next Wednesday, if we're not in the middle of snowpocalypse, which looks like it may be the case, but that's Temperance and Good Citizenship Day, and your districts have received bulletins from Chris Reichdahl and also from Kim Wyman at Secretary of State's office, dual sign letter endorsing work on Future Voter. And Future Voter is, of course, the campaign to get young people registered to vote, pre-registered, so your 16 and 17-year-olds. And Temperance and Good Citizenship Day legislation requires that all schools that have 12th graders provide class time on Temperance and Good Citizenship Day to register to vote. And we have all those resources once again available on the social studies OSPI website. There's also, if you go to the OSPI front page, and there's that slideshow of sort of recent or things that OSPI is highlighting. One of those is the Future Voter campaign. You can click on that as well, and it will take you to some resources, including a video by one of the Teacher of the Year candidates in Leavenworth, her class, that put together a voter registration video about the Future Voter campaign. So I don't want that to get away from people. It's really, I mean, civics, voting is at the center of our rights as citizens of the United States. We want to make sure that we're highlighting that with our students. That was a lot, but there you go. All right.
Linda, do you want to talk about the FAQ?
Oh, yes. State Board of Education is updating our social studies FAQ, and we will have that out soon, but we wanted to keep it in draft form until we looked at the questions from this webinar, so that we can include any questions there as well. And that'll be on our FAQ page. It should be, when you go to our front page, you'll find our FAQs.
It's true. We have an extensive collection of them.
Yeah, we'll link directly to that on the OSPI Social Studies website as well.
That'd be great. So, by the way, I'm Stephanie Davidsmeyer. You've been getting emails from me. I'm a communications manager for State Board, and I'm going to make sure that if you registered for this webinar, you'll get the PowerPoint which has the links. And anything else that you need from me, feel free to reach out. Let's start with some of the questions that have come in. Let's look at this one from Jenny Peterson. How does a principal waive a Washington State history requirement for an out-of-state student? Is there a form or something?
There is not a specific form, so it would be a process that is locally determined for how those actually get waived. In the rules, Washington State history can be waived for two groups of students, either students who are in their junior and senior year and missed taking Washington State history because of residency outside the state, or students that completed a state history course in another state. So those two groups of students can have it waived by the principal. It's a local decision and it would be a local process.
Next question, does APUSH cover civics?
Does AP US History cover civics? It should, yeah. I mean, the materials you get from College Board have quite a bit of civics in there. Sometimes people choose to specifically call out a push and then do a AP Gov. Once again, that's something that you should be having a conversation with your teaching staff about. In general, most people should be able to get their civics requirement out of taking a push class, yes.
Here's a clarifying one. There are world history standards at 9th and 10th grade, but no world history requirement. Is that true?
That is true. There's no credit requirement for world history, yet we do anticipate most students in high schools in Washington State do take a world history, an ancient civ or a world history class in their 9th or 10th grade year, and that is part of our scope and sequence, but there is no credit requirement. You're correct about that.
Can courses like psychology or sociology count as CWP?
Yes, I have opinions about that, but under the current language, they can. Yes, but once again, they need to make sure that they're teaching contemporary world problems within the scope of those courses. So if your anthropology or your psychology class is going to be given CWP credit, you need to make sure you're making those connections to contemporary world problems.
Here's another one. Could we have a course equivalency credit for civics in our criminal justice program?
So we've gotten some questions like that recently, and especially with CTE, because I think CTE often offers like a forensics and criminal justice programs. And frankly, we're still engaged in those conversations about how CTE is going to play with social studies. I would say that for the purpose of transcripts, you're really going to want to make sure that you're very clear about what contains civic content.
Right, and my own interpretation, I think what I have done in draft form in our SBE FAQ is that when you say a standalone civics course, bottom line is that it's transcribed as civics on the student's transcript.
We got that question more than one time, so I think that's one people are kind of wondering about. This person says, can civics be embedded in a CTE course that allows students to earn post-secondary and high school credit? My specific example is a CTE program called Criminal Justice. The course is 3 hours a day and students can get community college credit.
Right, so I think I would once again call you back to the legislation, and you need to look at what are the requirements for civic education under the legislation, and there's some very specific information about making sure that students are educated about tribal government, about state government, about federal government, checks and balances. There's some work on they need to be made aware of the naturalization test, which is part of a lot of states have sort of embedded the naturalization test into their civics as a graduation requirement. They take the test. My understanding from feedback from the field is, and people who were in on the civics legislation, is that that was not a test was not part of that, but definitely teaching about the questions that would be on the naturalization test as part of that. There are 6 elements, and you just need to make sure you're very cognizant about that. And we're really, as a standalone course, we're trying to be really intentional about making sure that students get a civics course that teaches them about government. And so I'm not sure that criminal justice really, there's no black helicopters, but I'm not sure that really falls under the auspices of civic ed as it's meant to be.
Thank you. So there's a question. We are developing a semester ethnic studies course to pair with civics course at the 12th grade level. If our students take a year of world history at 10th grade focused on the modern era, does this meet the 0.5 credit of CWP?
Well, if it's modern era, I'm assuming it's contemporary. There have been questions about what contemporary is, and we've basically fallen on that in general, post-World War II, and preferably post-Cold War, but there's a little bit of play in there depending on how you're going to structure things. So yeah, I think that within the context of contemporary world history, that counts as a CWP, or it could.
We got that question more than once too.
Mm-hmm. And hooray for ethnic studies.
Yeah.
Good job thinking about that.
Fantastic. Does the civic, this is kind of a clarification question, does the civics credit need to be transcripted as a standalone?
Yes, unless it's a dual credit, in which case there's going to be some sort of indication to local level that dual credit incorporated civics.
This one's easy, and I'm going to answer it. Is the Q&A being recorded? Yes, we're going to record this. I'm going to post the video as soon as I can make it accessible, and then hopefully you can use it as a resource and share it widely if you feel. Here's a follow-up. If you say that, back to civics, if you say that transcripted credit, if you say it needs to be transcripted credited as civics, how does that work if you embed it in a push or AP Gov? Do we need to add a civics flag like we do for Washington State history?
I would say no. I mean, I think that you would transcribe it as civics if the student takes a standalone civics course. If it's embedded in a dual credit course, then it wouldn't need to show up specifically on the transcript as civics.
Right. Once again, I think that's a local decision about how you transcribe it, but definitely I think with the standalones, you want to make sure that you're specifically calling out civics on the transcript. Yeah.
I see Michelle Ledbetter has her hand raised. If you want to type your question into the Q&A, I can read it aloud.
And going back to civics, Jerry, I know that there's been some questions about the naturalization piece at all. Do you want to expand on that?
Sure, yeah. So we've had a lot of questions because the legislative language is pretty ambiguous about it. And I can't pull it up right in front of me, but it's basically about teaching the elements of the citizenship and naturalization tests that pertain to civics. And if we're being literal about that, there are 100 possible questions in the civics bank of the naturalization test. Some states have chosen to take those bank of 100 questions and make that a quote unquote civics test that is assessed for graduation at the end of the year. There have been some states where they've played with that and they've said we're going to select the 10 of those 100 that we think are the most pressing and create some sort of a graduation requirement test for seniors who take civic education or civics course. Washington State, I went back to the people who actually helped create the legislation and were involved in it, and they said that wasn't really the spirit of the legislation. The legislation was, we want students to be cognizant of those things that a person wanting to become a United States citizen should know. And so that classroom instruction should be at least cognizant of and teaching towards some of those important questions that you might have, such as what are the 3 branches of government, or how does the judicial branch work, or who is your senator, or who is your congressman, those sorts of questions that show up on the citizenship test.
All right, we have a clarifying question from Casey here. If AP US history can count as civics, is that a 2-for-1 situation? Because US history is a one credit graduation requirement, how can one class count as 1.5 of the social studies credit?
I think in this case it would be a, it would be treated the way CTE course equivalency is taught. In other words, students earn 1 credit, but they meet more than 1 graduation requirement.
And just a reminder to people that are kind of raising their hand, if you utilize the Q&A box, that's where we're gonna read the questions aloud. And we have about 5 more minutes. There's another kind of question comment raised here from Susan. It's hard when we get transfer students from other districts to know when courses like civics are embedded in other courses like AP US history. It'd be helpful if it was identified in some format.
I agree. So it would be great if your district came up with a way, if you're going to embed civics into your APUSH or your AP Gov, that was called out in some way on the transcript, whether that be some sort of an asterisk with something on the bottom of the sheet of grades or whatever the case may be. It would be great if districts came up with that. I think that would help all of us with navigating that dual credit conundrum.
I think that we should, I'll take it on to look into this, to making a transcript change and just see how that can be done. It seems to me like Washington State history is a checkbox. It seems like civics should be a checkbox in that case too. Although as a standalone course, it'll show up directly on the transcript. So
right.
See what we can do.
So on that note, one of the most recent questions, can you please clarify regarding transcripting the civics credit? Is this what you're looking into? I think I heard that if it was integrated, for example, into criminal justice, that it would need to be transcribed as a civics credit, but that if it is embedded into an AP US class, it doesn't need to be listed separately on the transcript.
Well, yeah, I think that is true. I think that if it's in the criminal justice, that would be a CTE course, and it would have to be a dual credit course. So in that case, it would be a very similar situation to AP. Right. You would have to have the civics content in both the AP and the criminal justice course, and it would transcribe as the, the AP course would transcribe as the AP course. In the case of a dual credit CTE criminal justice course, it's up to the student how they want to transcribe it. But they could meet the civics graduation requirement without having it specifically show up on the transcript.
Right. Yeah, and I just want to reiterate, I mean, if you're going to embed civics into for example, a criminal justice CTE course, there needs to be a very clear understanding of what the civics requirements are and make sure that those are being met. Because criminal justice courses in general, the ones that I looked at when we've been investigating this, don't really call out really 4 of the 6 requirements of the civic education bill are not necessarily clearly implemented within a criminal justice course.
Right, and in that case, it is meeting the civics requirement through being a dual credit course as well. So not only would it need to be a criminal justice CTE course, but it would have to be a dual credit criminal justice CTE course and have the civics content.
Yep.
Woo, laws.
It's kind of messy.
A little bit, but I'm glad we're talking about it, and I'm glad you guys had some really good questions. We have 1 more minute or so. If anybody has any other questions, we just have a comment here. A checkbox like Washington State history would be very helpful. So thank you.
Agreed.
Okay, anything else for the good of the order? Jerry, Linda, you want to say anything else?
No, I'm just, thank you for 60 plus of you supposedly signed up for this, and I think that's fantastic. So thank you for your interest, and go social studies.
Go social studies.
Social studies.
We're polling right now if you want to share with me about the effectiveness of this. We also would like your feedback after the fact. I'm going to send an email with the PowerPoint and probably a link to the video, although I probably can't caption it, so we can't post it on our website right away, but I'm hoping to work towards that. So thank you all. This was our first kind of shot at doing this from the state board and directly talking about social studies. So thanks again, and by all means, use that contact information at the end of this PowerPoint presentation that you'll see right here.
Temperance and Good Citizenship
Oh,
Day
yeah.
next Wednesday, the 16th. Get your seniors registered to vote.
Do it.